There is something nobody warns you about when you first start making real money. It is not the taxes. It is not the market volatility. It is not the sleepless nights watching a position move against you. It is something far more invisible and far more devastating. It is the invisible ceiling. That moment when no matter how disciplined you become, no matter how refined your strategy gets, the money reaches a certain level and stops. Like a river that simply refuses to rise past a particular bank. You push, you adjust, you optimize, and the ceiling holds. I spent 11 years believing that ceiling was a personal failure, a gap in my knowledge, a weakness in my execution. It took a chance encounter with a man named Rabbi Ezriel Dovberstein in a small study room in Tzfat, northern Israel, to show me that the ceiling was not a flaw in my strategy. It was a flaw in my understanding of how wealth actually moves through a human life. What I am about to share with you is not motivational content. It is not spiritual decoration layered over financial advice to make it feel more profound. What Rabbi Dovberstein showed me that afternoon, drawing on a teaching lineage that traces back through 7 generations of Kabbalistic scholars, is a precise mechanism, a calendrical law. A specific act performed on a specific day that does not reduce your profit. It multiplies it. And the multiplication is not metaphorical. The people who have applied this exact practice have documented the results in ways that would make even the most hardened skeptic pause. But before I give you the day, before I give you the practice, you need to understand why it works. Because if you apply it without understanding it, you will perform the motion without activating the force. And the motion alone changes nothing. Rabbi Ezriel Dovberstein was not the kind of man who sought attention. He was in his late 70s when I met him, with a white beard that reached his collarbone and eyes that gave the impression he was always looking at something slightly beyond the room he was standing in. He had spent 40 years studying a branch of Kabbalistic teaching that focuses specifically on the relationship between material wealth and spiritual architecture. Not wealth as a symbol of divine favor. Wealth as a living system with its own laws, its own seasons, its own conditions for growth and contraction. He told me something in that first conversation that I have turned over in my mind almost daily since. He said that most people treat their money the way a frightened child treats a candle in a storm. They cup their hands around it, trying to protect the flame, not realizing that the cupping itself is what suffocates the light. He said that wealth, true generational wealth, the kind that accumulates in families and compounds across decades, has never been built by people who cup their hands. It has always been built by people who understood the counterintuitive law at the center of all Kabbalistic financial teaching, the law of deliberate release. Not random generosity, not spontaneous charity driven by guilt or social pressure. Deliberate release. On a specific day, in a specific manner, with a specific internal condition that, if absent, renders the entire act spiritually inert. Let me tell you about a man named Shmeriyahu Tannenfeld. He was a textile merchant in Vienna in the early 20th century, who documented his financial life in journals that his great-granddaughter later had translated and published in a small private edition. Those journals describe in meticulous detail how Shmeriyahu practiced the same principle I am about to teach you. He documented the dates. He documented the amounts he released. He documented what returned. Over a 22-year period, the pattern was so consistent, so precise in its timing, that his great-granddaughter, herself a professor of economic history at a university in Tel Aviv, described reading the journals as looking at a graph with one of the most reliable correlations she had ever encountered in her professional life. The release came first, the return followed. Always within a window she described as almost algorithmically predictable. Now I need to pause here, because I know what is happening in your mind right now. You are evaluating. You are holding this against your existing framework for how money works. And your existing framework is telling you that this sounds like superstition dressed in sophisticated language. I understand that resistance completely. I felt it myself sitting across from Rabbi Dovberstein. I was a person who traded futures. I lived by data, by probability distributions, by the cold arithmetic of risk-adjusted returns. I did not come to Tzfat looking for spiritual financial advice. I came to visit a friend. The conversation with the rabbi was unplanned, and the reason I stayed for 3 hours, the reason I canceled dinner and kept asking questions, was not that he overwhelmed my skepticism with rhetoric. It was that he began explaining the mechanism in terms that mapped onto systems I already understood. He described the financial dimension of a human life as a network of channels, not a metaphor, a functional description of how resources move through the system of your existence. He said that every channel has a capacity, and that most people spend their entire lives trying to increase what flows in, without ever addressing the width of the channel itself. But the width of the channel, he explained, is not determined by effort or skill or even intelligence. It is determined by one thing: whether the channel is moving. A channel that is gripping, hoarding, blocking is a channel that narrows, and a narrowed channel cannot carry more no matter how much pressure you put upstream. The act of deliberate release on the correct day is not charity in the conventional sense. It is channel maintenance. It is the practice of keeping the passage open so that greater volumes can move through it in both directions. Now, the specific day. In the Hebrew calendar, it is called Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the new lunar month. Rabbi Doberstein spent nearly an hour explaining why this particular day carries what he called heightened receptivity. The lunar cycle in Kabbalistic teaching is not simply an astronomical event. It is understood as a cyclical reset in the spiritual architecture underlying physical reality. At the moment the new moon appears, a window opens. The teachers who developed this framework over centuries described it as the point of maximum permeability between the material plane and the source layer from which material abundance flows. During this window, every intentional act is amplified. Every directed energy carries more momentum, and an act of deliberate release performed during this window does not simply open a channel. It opens a channel inside a tide. You can find Rosh Chodesh dates easily. They appear on any Hebrew calendar, and there are multiple accurate online converters that will show you every date through the coming years. They occur approximately monthly. Mark them. Protect them. Treat them the way a serious trader treats a high-probability setup. You prepare in advance. You do not improvise on the day itself. Now let me describe the practice precisely, because precision matters here more than sincerity. Sincerity without precision is a misdirected force. Rabbi Doberstein was emphatic about this. The ancient teachers who codified this practice were not poets. They were engineers of the unseen. They specified the conditions because the conditions are not decorative. They are functional. The first condition is internal stillness at the moment of release, not peace in some vague aspirational sense. Actual physiological stillness. Before you make the transfer, before you hand over the funds, you stop. You sit with your eyes closed for no less than 4 minutes. You breathe until the noise in your mind has genuinely reduced. You are not performing calmness. You are achieving it. The reason for this is that the intention imprinted on the act at the moment of release is what determines the spiritual weight of the act. An act released in a state of anxiety carries the vibration of scarcity into the channel and actually reinforces the narrowing rather than opening it. The stillness is not ceremonial. It is the precondition for the entire mechanism to function. The second condition concerns the amount. There is a principle in this teaching that Rabbi Doberstein phrased in a way I have never forgotten. He said the amount must reach the threshold of genuine hesitation, not recklessness, not an amount so large that releasing it constitutes irresponsibility, but an amount that, when you contemplate releasing it, produces a real and identifiable moment of internal resistance. That resistance is important. It is the signal that you are operating at the edge of your current channel capacity. And operating at that edge, with full intention and then releasing anyway, is precisely what expands the channel. If the amount produces no hesitation, no flutter of internal resistance, it is not performing the function. You are releasing inside your existing comfort zone, and comfort zones do not expand channels. They maintain them. The third condition is the recipient. The teaching here is specific and draws on a hierarchy that the ancient scholars developed with careful reasoning. The highest form of release is one in which you genuinely do not know who receives it, and they genuinely do not know who gave it. This is not modesty for its own sake. The removal of the identity transaction is what keeps the ego fully out of the act. When the ego participates, even partially, it converts the spiritual act into a social transaction. And social transactions operate on the physical plane alone, with physical plane returns. The ego wants recognition, gratitude, status. When it gets those things, it has already received its return. The spiritual channel receives nothing because the ego intercepted the signal. If complete anonymity is not achievable, the next most effective recipient is someone in genuine material crisis, with no other visible source of help. Not someone going through a difficult season, someone in structural crisis. The specificity of their need concentrates the energy of the act. The fourth condition is the spoken declaration. Before the release, out loud, alone, you make 3 statements. First, you express genuine gratitude for having the capacity to give, not performed gratitude. Real recognition that the resources passing through your hands came through you rather than from you. Second, you declare that you are releasing this amount without contractual expectation. This is subtle and important. You are not releasing it while secretly expecting the return. You are releasing it because the act itself is the correct alignment with the law. The return is a consequence of that alignment, not a payment for it. Third, you state your intention to remain an open channel, to continue this practice consistently, and to receive what comes through without gripping it as a permanent possession. You say these 3 things aloud. The vocalization matters because speech is the bridge between internal intention and external reality. An intention that remains interior remains partial. Speaking it completes the circuit. The 5th condition is total release afterward. This is the condition that most people fail. They perform the act correctly and then spend the following days mentally monitoring the horizon for the return. That monitoring is a form of gripping. It is the hand cupping the candle. Rabbi Dovberstein described it as planting a seed and then digging it up every morning to check whether it has sprouted. The digging destroys the root before it has any chance to establish. Once the act is completed, it is completed. You return to your life, your work, your practice. You do not track it. You do not calculate odds. You do not quietly audit your incoming opportunities looking for the return. You trust the law, and you let the timing belong to the mechanism, not to your anxiety. I want to tell you what happened to me in the months following that conversation in Tzfat, because I think the specifics matter more than the generalization. I came home skeptical, but intellectually interested enough to test it. I treated it the way I would treat a new trading hypothesis. I would run the experiment with discipline and document the results, without inflating or diminishing what I observed. The first Rosh Chodesh after my return, I followed the practice exactly as Rabbi Dovberstein had described it. I identified a family in my community who were in genuine structural crisis. A father who had lost his business, 3 children, a mother managing a health situation that was consuming whatever savings they had left. I made an anonymous transfer through an intermediary. The amount reached my hesitation threshold. It was not reckless, but it was real enough that releasing it produced exactly the internal resistance the rabbi had described. 7 days later, a partnership proposal arrived from a contact I had not spoken to in nearly 2 years. The structure of the deal was one I would not have designed myself, but when I modeled it out, the risk-adjusted return over 36 months was significant, not coincidental, structurally significant. I entered the partnership. Over the following year, the financial results exceeded the projection. I continued the practice every Rosh Chodesh. I documented every cycle. The correlation between the practice and the opening of opportunities did not produce identical results every month. That is not how any living system works. But the directional pattern across the full year was undeniable to anyone willing to look at it honestly. I am not asking you to believe my results. I am asking you to consider running the experiment yourself with the same rigor you would apply to any other hypothesis you take seriously. I want to address something that Rabbi Dovberstein raised in our final hour together, which he called the most important warning in the entire teaching. He said that across his decades of observation, he had seen people attempt this practice in the wrong internal condition and produce outcomes that were worse than neutrality. He was specific about what the wrong internal condition looks like. It is the condition of performing the act as a transaction, giving the amount and privately, beneath the surface declaration, holding an expectation of receiving a specified return in a specified time frame. He said this is the most common corruption of the practice and the most invisible, because the person performing it is often entirely unaware of the transactional layer running beneath their stated intention. The ego is extraordinarily skilled at disguising its transactional agenda behind the language of spiritual alignment. He said you can identify whether you are operating transactionally by observing your emotional state in the days following the release. If you notice yourself scanning your environment for the return, cataloging incoming possibilities and measuring them against what you gave, you are operating transactionally. The mechanism is not engaged. You are performing a financial gamble and calling it a spiritual practice. The way to correct this is to return to the first condition, the stillness, and stay there longer before you release. The stillness is what allows the transactional layer to dissolve. You cannot force it to dissolve by willing it away. You have to create the internal space in which it loses its grip on its own. He also warned against performing the practice publicly in any form. He said that in every generation, there are people who discover these teachings and immediately construct a visible identity around the practice. They give in ways that others can see. They speak about their giving in gatherings and in written communications. They use their giving to build a personal narrative about their own spiritual sophistication. He said this is the fastest way to permanently close the channel they are attempting to open. The attention of other human beings is a complete substitute for the spiritual return, and the system, which operates with a form of precision that the Rabbi described as ruthless in its accuracy, allocates the return accordingly. They have already received it. It arrived in the form of other people's admiration, and that admiration is all they will receive. There is one final element of this teaching that I want to share, because it addresses the question I have been asked most frequently by people I have introduced this practice to. The question is this: what if nothing comes back? What if I perform this practice with genuine intention, real stillness, the correct amount, the correct recipient, the complete release, and the material return simply does not appear? Rabbi Doberstein answered this question in a way that rearranged something in my understanding permanently. He said that the return is never absent. What is sometimes absent is the capacity to perceive it in the form it arrives. He said that when a channel genuinely opens and the divine flow passes through it, the return is not always financial in the first instance. Sometimes it arrives as a sudden clarity about a decision that has been blocking you for months. Sometimes it arrives as the dissolution of a relationship that was quietly draining your energy and your focus. Sometimes it arrives as a restoration of your physical capacity to function at the level your work requires. He said that people who are fixated on the financial form of the return often walk past these other arrivals without recognizing them, which creates the false impression that the practice failed. He said the practice never fails when the conditions are genuinely met. What fails is the narrowness of the frame through which the practitioner is looking for the results. And he closed with something that I have carried with me since that afternoon in the small room in Tzfat, sitting across from a man whose life was, by any measurable standard, an ongoing demonstration of the principle he was describing. He said that the people who have always held the most wealth in the world are not, at their core, the cleverest or the most aggressive or the most strategically sophisticated. They are the ones who understood, usually because someone took the trouble to teach them, that wealth is not a possession, it is a relationship. And like all relationships, it flourishes in the presence of generosity and contracts in the presence of fear. The day of Rosh Chodesh is not magic. It is simply the moment when the conditions for that relationship to deepen are at their most favorable. Show up on that day with an open hand and a quiet mind, and you are not performing a ritual. You are honoring a law as reliable as any other law that governs the world you are already living in. The question has never been whether the law works. The question has only ever been whether you are willing to test it.